different ways. So I'm just going to click record now from this point on. So let me go through the poem with you. I'm going to read it to you, then I'm going to tell you briefly what it's about, then hopefully I'm going to give you some key information that you can take away. Okay, so this is Ozymandias, and as you can see on the page, it's written in what we call the sonnet form. So it's written in the sonnet form. So let me read it to you. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Genius poem. Let me take you through what it means at its base level before we go into some details. So essentially, it talks about this statue that is in the desert, and essentially it is from ancient Egypt. So a ruler called Ramesses II, he paid for a sculptor to carve a statue, to sculpt a statue for him with to show his power, to show his might. And this statue tells us about how this guy used to rule. And we can very, very clearly see from the poem, from this statue, that Ramesses II was a cruel, ruthless, and he was a vain dictator. And I think that's really, really important. This poem examines the notion of power. And what's interesting about this poem, it's told in the first person, so the poetic voice is the first person, who hears the story of Ozymandias from a traveller. And he tells us that this statue has now been destroyed, it's decayed. And it's interesting that the poem and the story of Ozymandias remains with the traveller. He's been forgotten in time, and it only remains with a traveller. That is absolutely crucial. And as I've said before, this is a poem that explores the nature and the dangers of power. And that's why it's in the power and conflict section of the anthology. So that's what the poem is about. It looks at this statue that is now dilapidated, is now a complete wreck. But it looks at when Ramesses II was in power, the type of leader he was, and his characteristics. So my biggest tip for you going into poetry is this: revise a little in detail. Don't try to learn every line, that would be ridiculous, but try to look at every line, examine every line, and choose 3 or 4 that you can talk about in detail. So I'm going to prove that to you now. So I'm going to take you through what I think are 4, maybe 3 of the most important lines and what they mean and how we can analyze them. So let's start with this line, shattered visage lies. Now, this is the imagery of the face of the statue of Ozymandias, which over time has been decayed, it's shattered. And I think that word shattered is really, really important. It's what we call onomatopoeia. It's a word that sounds like the sound it's describing. And what Shelley is doing for us there is he's propagating, he's amplifying this idea of something being destroyed. Now, it's not just the statue that's been destroyed. It shows that his power has been destroyed over time. And the onomatopoeia there, that word shattered, is crucial because it gives us that notion that power is temporary. It doesn't last forever. And that's what Shelley is trying to tell us. And visage is, of course, another kind of a posh word for face, I suppose. And it shows how Ozymandias' identity and what he stood for has been lost. Yes, in the moment when he ruled, yes, he was powerful, but Shelley is warning to people with power, it does not last forever. However arrogant you are, however vain you are, it does not last forever. So that's the first line that I talk about, that word shattered, what it means and what it's telling us, and the fact that it's a face that's been shattered. It shows his identity has been lost over time. And his identity has been lost so much that actually the story of Ozymandias now remains with a traveller. And of course, traditionally going back through time, someone who doesn't have a fixed abode is seen low in the social hierarchy, rightly or wrongly. But that's what Shelley is telling us, that ultimately his story now only remains with those people. Fascinating. So that's the first line I'd talk about. Let's go to the second line that I think is really important, is the sneer of cold command. Now, this is describing how the statue looked. Now, a sneer is a really interesting word to use. Basically, it's a smile or a sound that is mocking, and is certainly derogatory, and is certainly looking down on someone. And that is what Shelley is trying to tell us about Ozymandias and how he ruled. He ruled in a kind of a mocking, ruthless manner. He was clearly a dictator who ruled through fear, and that is why that word is used by Shelley. So the word highlights the ruthlessness of Ozymandias. This is a ruler who mocked his subjects, didn't support his subjects, wasn't just with his subjects. He was cruel, he was ruthless, and that is why that word sneer is used. A leader that mocks is clearly a leader who rules through fear. But interestingly, if we look at that phrase "cold command," and yes, that word "cold" shows that he was unsympathetic, that he didn't have any feelings, and he ruled in a way that was kind of robotic, not humane. But I think what's interesting is the alliteration, so the repetition at the start of words of consonant sounds. But those consonant sounds in particular, they're very harsh sounds, the sneer of cold command. And what that does is it really illustrates, does it not, how aggressive and terrifying Ozymandias was. That's how he ruled. If you command someone in a cold fashion, you think about the connotations of that. You have no feelings, no thoughts for other people. You just rule because you can exploit the power that you have. So you've got that word sneer, that idea of mocking, and then we've got the harsh alliteration of that C sound. So we're starting to see through Shelley's techniques the type of ruler Ozymandias was. And it's not a pretty sight. And that is why he is absolutely doing it. So let's go to the famous one. So what we've got is this statue that is all over the place, that is in bits. It absolutely is in complete bits. But on the pedestal, on the bottom, we've got the words of Ozymandias himself, and it shows what he thought of himself when he ruled, but also now shows how he is made to look ridiculous. And he says, "My name is Ozymandias. Look on my works." This is a guy who really thought a lot of himself. And we're going to use some words later on to describe what that means. But he really did think a lot of himself, this guy. And how's that shown through the language? Well, you need to talk about that word "my." That's a possessive pronoun. And I think what that does, and it's repeated throughout on the pedestal. So the use of that possessive pronoun shows that he has a lot of pride and arrogance and vanity in who he is. My name. That's what it does. Absolutely. It really does. I can see people are raising a hand. We're going to go to a Q&A session in a minute, so you'll be able to say something about that. Okay, so we'll go to the Q&A session. I'll do about 2 or 3 of them during the webinar. I hope that's okay. And then, of course, you can see he uses that imperative verb, look on my works. And when people use imperative verbs, when they do command in such a way, we can see that amplifies his dominance and his overpowering nature. But he's asking people to look at his works, look at what he has done, look at what he has achieved. And that shows the type of person that he was, vain and all the rest of it. Absolutely. Good. And finally, some of you might know, of course, that here, when he says, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," we can see when he says "ye mighty," he's actually talking to God. And you can see that because mighty has a capital M. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Absolutely, we can see there that he is mocking God. I am better than you. He sees himself as a god. He absolutely does. So those are the lines that I would look at in detail. But I've got some words for you that are really crucial. I would use these with in your essays if you do get Ozymandias as one of your name poems or the poem that you're comparing. Here are a couple of words that are really, really crucial. The first one is narcissism. And what I've done there, I've broken it up there. It is one word, narcissism. And essentially that means excessive self-love, vanity, and fascination with oneself. So narcissism. So we would say that Ozymandias is presented by Shelley as a narcissist. So excessive self-love, vanity, and fascination with oneself. And how do we put that in an essay? Well, we'd say Shelley reveals Ozymandias' narcissism through the repeated use of the possessive pronoun. The examiner would love that. Absolutely love it. Use the terminology narcissism, and also you've looked at the terminology with the possessive pronoun. You've done some language analysis. This is a person who's writing well about poetry. Those types of words. And what I do in these sessions is I give you some of the things that the examiner will like to see. That bit there in blue, in that kind of ribbon there in blue, that's the type of thing the examiner would like to see. Absolutely. So let me give you another word. You've got narcissism. Let's do another word for you, and that is hubris. And hubris essentially means excessive pride or self-confidence. That's what hubris means. It's a great word. Those of you that study Macbeth will be using that word. But essentially, what does that mean? Hubris, excessive pride or self-confidence. How do we write about it? Shelley illustrates Ozymandias' hubris through the use of the imperative verb look in the line, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. His hubris because he's mocking God. He's got so much pride and self-confidence, he sees himself as a god. So there are two words for you. You've got narcissism and hubris. And we've looked at some of those key sentences and phrases you might like to use. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press pause for a little bit. I'm just going to test your knowledge. So I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to answer these questions. And my advice to you all with your revision is at some point, so we've done about 12, 13 minutes of revision here, looking at this poem. Always make sure you go back and test yourself, because the more we test ourselves and the more we get things wrong and correct ourselves, the more that we learn. So here we are. 5 questions for you. You've got 2 recall tests today. Let's see how you get on with this. I'm going to mute for a bit. I might ask a couple of questions. Let's see how you get on. Good luck with this. Okay, so the five recall questions are here. So the story of Ozymandias, who does that come from? Who knows the story of Ozymandias and what's significant about it? Which line with alliteration highlights and emphasizes Ozymandias ruling with fear? How do we know Ozymandias had excessive pride and vanity, otherwise known as hubris? And what term is used for a person who has excessive self-love? And when Ozymandias says, "Ye mighty," to whom is he talking? Well, let's see how he got on. So, of course, the story of Ozymandias comes from a traveller, and it's significant because it shows how this once powerful ruler, how his power has been forgotten over time, and now it just resides with a traveller, a lowly traveller, some might say. The line with alliteration that highlights and emphasises Ozymandias ruling with fear is sneer of cold command. How do we know Ozymandias had excessive pride and vanity, hubris? Well, we've got repetition of the possessive pronoun my, shows how much he likes himself. And what term is used for a person who has excessive love? That's excessive self-love, sorry, that's a narcissist. And when Ozymandias says, "Ye mighty," to whom is he talking? He is talking to God. Well, very sorry, the question answer function isn't working at the moment. So I'll get it working at the end so I can hear from some of you. So let's crack on. Do take a slug of tea, as I'm about to do, and we're going to go on now to give you your next tip on how to get the examiner to give you marks. And you know, one of the best ways you do is get marks, of course, is to understand this poetry as well as possible, to be passionate about the poetry, but also to some extent you have to understand what the examiner wants from you. So we're going to go on to that in a second. Do excuse me. Okay, let's move on. So one of my biggest bits of advice, it's one of my huge frustrations, is that not enough students in their essays comment on the poem's form and structure. They shy away from it. Now, when we talk about the form, that means the style of the poem. And when we talk about the structure of the poem, we mean how the poem has been organized. So being organized in a certain manner. So I'm going to talk to you and teach you how to write about this poem's form and structure and the significance of it. So let's talk in general about this poem. Well, first of all, this poem is a sonnet. That's the first thing to say, is a sonnet, and sonnets are supposed to be about love. Now, this isn't a poem about love, or is it? Perhaps it's in the sonnet form because Shelley wanted to show how much Ozymandias loved himself. It kind of amplifies his narcissism, if you like. But sonnets also have to have a rhyme scheme. They absolutely have to have a rhyme scheme. Sorry, I can see that someone has got their hand raised. I can't use the Q&A function at the moment. I will try to sort that out. So my apologies, and I'll be able to chat at the end to all of you as well in a particular way. So apologies for that at this moment. So sonnets are supposed to rhyme. They are supposed to have a rhyme scheme, but we can see, if you look at the bits in yellow, we've got a bit of rhyme in this sonnet. We've got land and sand. Those rhyme very well indeed. They're full rhymes, 100%. Those two rhyme. But then we've got rhymes such as stone and frown. Now, what you notice those words is they rhyme, but not to a total degree. They're what we call half rhymes, or a great word for you is pararhyme. Now, sonnets are not supposed to have pararhyme. They're supposed to rhyme fluently. So it's really, really interesting that almost the structure of this poem breaks down a little bit. It's imperfect. So yes, it's a sonnet, but it is unquestionably what we would call an imperfect sonnet. That is really, really important. Imperfect sonnet. So that is what we call pararhyme. Absolutely fascinating. Equally, let me just move my floating head. Excuse me. Let's go over here. Let's go over here. Equally, I mean, sonnets are supposed to be really beautiful to read. They're supposed to be really fluid. They're supposed to be very lyrical, and use loads of different things to make them fluid. And when you read a Shakespearean sonnet or a Petrarchan sonnet, you might have done that in your lessons. They're very beautiful to read. They're very pleasing to read. This poem isn't. Now, when I read this to you at the start of the session, it's really difficult to read. Give your teachers an easy time here. They are very, very difficult indeed to read. And they're very difficult because, first of all, in yellow, you can see that bit in yellow, stand in the desert. You can see that full stop that is halfway through a line. Now, that is what we call a caesura. So that bit top left there, a caesura, a break or pause in a line of poetry. And sonnets are not supposed to do that traditionally, because sonnets are supposed to be fluid, they're supposed to be lyrical, they're supposed to be beautiful. But what is happening here is that the sonnet form is being disrupted. It's being almost dismantled, a bit like the statue. And it's really, really clever. Equally, you can see where the red little boxes are after antique land and stone. You can see that there's no punctuation there. And we call that enjambment, which is the practice of lines of poetry running onto one another. So no punctuation at the end of the line. Now, whilst in some poems that is really effective, in a sonnet it's not, because it loses control. And I think what Shelley is trying to tell us with his form and with his structure is that the poem loses control in the same way the statue has lost control, in the same way that Ozymandias has lost control. So we've seen that with caesura, with enjambment. We've also seen it with rhyme. And it's a really intelligent way of structuring it. It absolutely is. Let's go on to what we call the rhythm of the poem. Now, sonnets, generally speaking, are written in what we call iambic pentameter. And you can see in this line here, I met a traveller from an antique land. You can see all the dots above the words are syllables. The blue dots are the unstressed syllables, and the green dots, if you like, are the stressed syllables. So we've got there very clearly, I met a traveller from an antique land. If I just get my fingers up here, okay, so I met a traveller from an antique land. We can see we've got 10. We've got 10 sets or 5 sets of didum. Didum, 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 didum. I met a traveller from an antique land. And it's this meter, this rhythm, that gives sonnets their lyrical, fluid, beautiful quality. And what Shelley has done, he's adopted that, he's used that. But what happens to the rhythm? Well, the rhythm goes wrong in this poem. It goes catastrophically wrong. And if we look at this line, my name is Ozymandias, king of kings. There's one extra syllable in that line. So we can see that actually the structure, again, it starts to be eroded. It starts to dilapidate. There's no such thing as iambic pentameter plus one. He's got it wrong, but he's got it wrong on purpose, because he's trying to prove that however much you want to hold on to power, power will get you over time. It absolutely will. Okay, so that's that bit there. Now we're talking grade 7, 8, and 9 here. But why shy away from it? Talking about the structure and the form of the poetry. So let's just revise ourselves at that. So the poem is a sonnet, and it's a mixture of what we call a Shakespearean sonnet and a Petrarchan sonnet. And caesura and enjambment, it seems to disrupt the poem's power, as does the meter of the poem, the iambic pentameter. And ultimately, the sonnet is an imperfect sonnet. And essentially, does the poem's structural weakness, does that show that power is temporary? Is it similar to the statue? And here's how you write about it. You might get the phones out at this point. So we can say here, Shelley's use of structure seems to reflect the characteristics of the statue itself. It's unstable, it's fragmented, and it's disrupted. And the next bit, Shelley is suggesting that in time, power will decay, dilapidate, and be eradicated, just like the structure of his sonnet. Now, it's really, really clever to choose the sonnet form to highlight the narcissism, but then deconstruct the sonnet form, make it imperfect, to promote and to illustrate the points he wanted to make. And that is why this poem is genius. It's a brilliant, brilliant poem for that reason. Do you want to take a photo of that? And yes, I will make these slides available to people. Very good. Well, let's move on. So let's talk a bit about context, a bit about what was going on and why Shelley wrote this poem. Let me go through that. So in Shelley's time, he disagreed with the government policies, especially the growth of the empire. He was very, very anti that. And maybe this poem was a warning about the British Empire's hubris. And of course, British Empire doesn't exist anymore. So in time, he was proved absolutely right, but you need to be talking about the context, perhaps in the conclusion of your essays. So talking about why Shelley wrote this. This was very, very clearly a warning to the government. Very brave to do, very radical guy to do that. What else? Well, I've told you this before. This is why I like the poem. The poem has a timeless quality to it. You know, it's relevant in 1817, and I think, regrettably, it is relevant in 2024 as well. And it shows that civilizations fall and crumble with time, including classical ones. But maybe the words on the statue, of course, have survived. I think that's quite interesting, because that could be a message from Shelley. He obviously loved poetry. He loved being a wordsmith and using words for effect. Perhaps that implies that the words of poets outlive the words of dictators. Who knows? But you need to make comments about context in your poetry. Really important. You might take a quick photo of that while I take a slug of tea. Excuse me. Very good. Okay. So, oh look, my head's on the end of that boot there. So let's just go into thematic, some thematic learning about this poem, because essentially the overriding theme of this poem is that power corrupts. That's how Shelley was approaching this. Power corrupts. If we get power, ultimately he's saying that everyone will use it for corruption, for evil. They'll misuse it, they'll abuse it, they'll dominate others with it. That sort of thing. Pretty dark stuff, I suppose, but that's the warning that Shelley is giving us. Now, I wonder whether you can think of any real world examples of where power corrupts. I wonder whether you can think of any. Let me give you a few examples. Well, we had a few years ago, we had, of course, when an American president refused to accept election results. Very controversial. I don't want to get political on here, but I think that is really, really interesting. That might be one of those. If we think about dictators over time and what they've done, obviously I feel a bit bad about putting my head next to these people for obvious reasons. They've got dictators, Hitler and Stalin there, and think about the way in which the poem relates to those types of leaders and that political ideology of being a dictator. Of course, it's incredibly relevant. It absolutely is. And just finally, really on this, those of you that have seen the series Breaking Bad, it might be an 18, so apologies if parents are watching, but I know lots of my students have seen this series Breaking Bad. It's about a man who becomes very powerful in the narcotics world, but one of the most iconic television episodes, I think, of the last 10 years is the one where he gets above his station. He thinks he's more powerful than he is, and the name of that episode is Ozymandias. And you can see there on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you can see there that ode to Shelley's poem where he pretends to be that statue. It's a brilliant piece of television, and it shows, doesn't it? It just exemplifies for us how this idea has stood the test of time. It really, really has. Okay, well, we're going to go into our second recall test. So there's 5 questions. What's the form of the poem? What is a caesura? What happens to the rhythm, to the meter of the poem? This poem can be seen as Shelley's warning to whom or what. Which poem could you compare this with if you got a question on power? There's a question for you there. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer those questions. See how you get on. Good luck. Also, I think I've unlocked the chat function. If you've got any questions for me, then do put that in the chat. It's only me that be able to see the chat. Okay, well, let's go through the answers. So, what is the form of the poem? What's a caesura? What happens to the rhythm, the meter of the poem? This poem can be seen as Shelley's warning to whom or what. And which poem could you compare this with if you got a question on power? The answers are here. The form of the poem, Ozymandias, is a sonnet. It's a really bizarre mixture of a Petrarchan and a Shakespearean sonnet, but it's an imperfect sonnet. It doesn't work as a sonnet. What is a caesura? It's a midline break or pause in line of poetry. What happens to the rhythm, the meter of the poem? Well, the iambic pentameter is imperfect, and there's 11 syllables in one line, not 10. This poem can be seen as Shelley's warning to whom or what? Well, the British government and their empire building. And which poem could you compare this with if you've got a question on power? London. Checking out my history, My Last Duchess, Kamikaze, to name but a few. So I wonder how you got on with that. So what I've got for you here, and if you come to my other sessions, I'll give these to you. What I've got is a knowledge organizer for you all. So what I've done is I've distilled and I've reduced all of the key information from my session on Ozymandias into one little bit here. Now, what you might like to do is quickly take a photo of that, but you can see I've just broken it down into what's the key message, the three main quotes, and a comment on structure, and a comment on context as well. So you might like to take a photo of that. If you come to all of my sessions, by the time you finish all of my sessions, you will have a knowledge organizer on all of them, which will be incredibly useful, I'm sure.